You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Monday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, see all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio. Find out all the different places where you can hear this show in its audio format. Now, you can also come over and watch this show being simulcast in video over on my YouTube stream. And while you're there, you can join the live chat room that's filled with all the other Intrepids discussing all sorts of topics and this show. Come on over, meet those people over there, have a good time meeting them and listening to the show and watching the video. And that is at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, a couple of points of business. If you're looking for a good designer, a good illustrator for children's books, for book covers, for advertising, for corporate identity, logo design, all of that sort of thing, come on over to my site, scottallenroberts.com. And if you're watching the video, it's in the ticker right down below us. You'll see my website, scottallenroberts.com. And you can contact me through there. My phone number's there. Every contact in the world is there for me. And you can also avail yourself of some of the shirt designs and coffee mugs, hoodie designs, and all the different things that we design for this show, particularly, specifically for you listeners. And that's over at my Etsy page, which is also in the scroll bar down below, if you're watching. If you're not, that's etsy.com/shop/Son of a Patriot. And then you can find all my stuff over there. And that's about all I got to push at the moment. We got that out of the way, other than my friend John Penman, who makes Penman hats. And you can see them right over here. You can see his logo up here. You can see a bunch of his hats that fit my head hanging on my hat rack behind me. Go over to penmanhats.com. PENMAN hats.com. See the best in bespoke, custom-made hats that you'll ever want to find. All right, folks, let's move on. It's Monday evening. I want to thank you for being here, those of you who are here over the weekend, and join me for It's Sunday on Sunday morning. And I just wanted to put out another very heartfelt sadness and condolences to our friend Morgan Snow over in the chat room, who lost her husband on Saturday after some long health battles that he's been having. And so our heart goes out to you, and may you find some peace. And so, folks, we have a tight community over there. And it doesn't seem like a lot in the grand scheme of the world, but it's always nice to go, like the old TV show said, where everybody knows your name. And people care about you, and they're not intrusively caring, meaning it's not a gossipy, although gossip is part of human nature, so you can't avoid it, but we've got a lot of good people that are part of the Intrepid family, so come on over and join us. And today we're going to wrap up the story of the Apache and Geronimo, and then we're really going to get into a couple of the episodes that will, in a sense, wrap up our look at the taking of the American West by the United States. And some of this material I've covered before. It's all about Wovoka and the ghost dance and how that led up to the massacre at Wounded Knee. And then the current day, more current day, the more contemporary standoff at Wounded Knee that took place about 40 years ago, a little over 40 years ago, at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And so that's how we'll wrap up this series, maybe a few other episodes of falling action, if you will. But let's finish up the Apache and Geronimo today. And if you can, block out the screaming of my small children out there, because Mom is gone and Dad is here recording. This is the time they all have to come into the house and scream. So if you're hearing that, that's all it is. There's not really a child massacre going on in my outer rooms here. It's just the kids. So, trying to stop them from doing that has been nightmarish. It's like you have to lock them away in a closet, or do you lock them outdoors? What do you do? I lock my door, and guess what? The 5-year-old just picked my lock. Or it was the 8-year-old. So my children have no respect for the fact that I record a show, because they're always opening the door, always coming in, always screaming, always making mischief while I am recording. So if you can bear with me while I'm talking about these important things, while listening to my children screaming in the background or trying to come in and interrupt the show, you have my...
Hey, Daddy.
Can you go out and close the door, please? Now, I don't want to hear a single word. Bye. There you go. As if on cue. All right. Now, let's get into the meat of tonight's show. Remember last week we were talking... And by the way, in case you're worried, I will talk with my kids and mete out proper justice or appropriate measures as seen fit. But for my children, especially 8 going on 9, to act like that... Do you have kids? You know how they act sometimes. To do that, that's just them either showing off to the audience or them... just being disrespectful. And I don't like that. And it's not ending no matter what I do. So we're going to have some serious come-to-Jesus meetings with my children over the time that I'm in the studio with this show. So there you go. That's for your edification. And, you know, we've talked about parenting and child raising and all that kind of stuff on this show before. Maybe we'll talk about that some more when we're done with this series. You can bring your ideas to, give me any ideas. If you've got ideas about parenting, about dealing with children. Children aren't always compliant, as you can see. My children are a prime example of that. And so what does a parent do when the children aren't compliant? What does a parent do when they're in the middle of something like a phone call, a meeting, a radio broadcast, things like that, and children act up? We'll talk about those things because we've talked about them before. And we'll get into how to be a decent parent in a world where being a good parent is sometimes frowned upon. And so you can bring your ideas, and we'll hit that topic. And now that we're about 7 minutes and 20 seconds into the broadcast, let's get to the meat of what we were going to talk about tonight. And that's kind of wrapping up on the Apache and Geronimo. Now, remember the Meeker massacre, as it's called. And the troops coming in, and the Apache, and that was with the Apache uprising, and all that was going on at the reservations, the White Mountain Indian Wars that started, I guess, I was stumbling around for the right word, and the U.S. government is wanting to settle this down, and so with every recent outbreak at the White Mountain, it had brought an increase of the numbers of soldiers. And the soldiers were swarming everywhere at Fort Thomas, Fort Apache, Fort Bowie, and with each increase brought more unrest among the Apaches on the reservation, and more flights to Mexico, and with the inevitable raiding against the ranchers all along the escape routes to get out of the reservation territory. And so to try to bring order out of chaos, the Army, now this is a bit in review, the Army called in General George Crook, who the Sioux referred to as Three Fingers Crook, and who the Apache had years earlier referred to as Graybeard Crook. And he was quite a different man from the one who had left Arizona 10 years earlier to go north to fight the Sioux and the Cheyenne. And he had learned from them and from the Ponkas during the trial of Standing Bear, where Standing Bear becomes a person, a recognized man, human being with rights, that Indians were human beings. And a viewpoint that most of his fellow officers had not yet accepted. And as I mentioned last week when we touched on this, it's most of the United States officers of the military who stood for the Indians ended up being removed from their posts, somehow discredited, and it was a problem. And so many had not yet accepted that the Indians were actually human beings, just like they were. And on September 4th of 1882, Crook assumed command of the Department of Arizona at Whipple Barracks. And he hurried on to the White Mountain Reservation, and he held councils with the Apaches at San Carlos and Fort Apache, and he searched out individual Indians, and he talked to them privately. He said, I discovered immediately that a general feeling of distrust of our people existed among all the bands of the Apache. And he reported, it was with much difficulty that I even got them to talk. But after breaking down their suspicions, they conversed freely with me. They told me that they had lost confidence in everybody and did not know whom or what to believe anymore, and that they were constantly told by irresponsible parties that they were to be disarmed or that they were to be attacked by troops on the reservations and removed from their country, and that they were fast arriving at the conclusion that it would be more manly to die fighting than to be thus destroyed. This is what Crook reported. And he was convinced that the reservation Apaches, quote, had not only the best reasons for complaining, but had displayed remarkable forbearance in remaining at peace, end quote. He said, we wouldn't have stayed at peace like that if it were us, who our homes were attacked, and our nation attacked, our country. So early in his investigations, he discovered that the Indians had been plundered of their rations and of the goods purchased by the government for their subsistence and support, and by rascally agents and other unscrupulous white men, he wrote. He found plenty of evidence that white men were trying to arouse the Apaches to a violent action so that they could then be driven from their reservations, leaving it open for land grabbing. So this is what Crook, the conclusion he came to. The whites are pressing the Apache and, in a sense, prodding him into attacking back to defend himself so they can then have them removed militarily. Now, Crook ordered an immediate removal of all white squatters and miners from the reservation. He ordered this. All whites out, off the reservation. If you're a squatter, you don't belong here. If you're a miner, you don't have permission from the tribe to be here, off the reservation. And then he demanded complete cooperation from the Indian Bureau in introducing reforms. Instead of being forced to live near San Carlos or Fort Apache, the different bands were given the right to choose any part of the reservation to build their homes and their ranches. It's their reservation. Let them choose where they want to live. And this was so unorthodox for Crook. And hay contracts would be given to the Apaches instead of to white suppliers. The army would buy all the excess corn and vegetables the Indians could raise, and they paid them for it in cash. They would be expected to govern themselves, to reorganize their police, and to hold their own courts, as they had done under John Clume. And Crook promised that they would see no soldiers on their reservation unless they found it impossible to control themselves. So Crook was all for give them the autonomy we told them they could have on their reservation. We've already taken their land from them. Now we've given them this spot of land. Let them be autonomous. And at first the Apaches, as you can imagine, were very skeptical of what Crook was trying to do. They remembered Crook's harsh ways in the old days when he was known as Gray Wolf and he was hunting down Cochise and the Chiricahuas. But they soon discovered that he meant what he said. And rations became more plentiful. The agents and the traders no longer cheated them. There were no soldiers to bully them, and the Gray Wolf encouraged them to build up their herds and seek out better places to grow corn and beans. And they were free again so long as they remained within the reservation. So it's kind of like you're free, but stay within the confines of your own little country that we've allowed you to set up, the borders of which we've set up for you. So there was still an injustice there, but he's saying you can be autonomous within this injustice. And so the Apache, however, couldn't forget their relatives who were truly free in Mexico. and there were always a few young men slipping southward, a few returning with exciting news of adventures and good times. And Crook also gave much thought to the Chiricahua and the Warm Springs Apaches in Mexico. He knew it was only a matter of time before they'd raid once more across the border, and he knew that he must be ready for them. The United States government had recently signed an agreement with the Mexican government permitting soldiers of each country to cross the border in pursuit of hostile Apaches. And he was preparing to take advantage of this agreement, and he was hoping that by doing so he could keep the Arizona and the New Mexico civilians from forcing him to start a war with the Apache. Now, it's too often the case, Crook said, that border newspapers disseminate all sorts of exaggerations and falsehoods about the Indians, which are copied in papers of high character and wide circulation in other parts of the country, while the Indian side of the case is rarely ever heard. In this way, the people at large get false ideas with reference to the matters. Then when the outbreak does come, public attention is turned to the Indians. Their crimes and atrocities are alone condemned, while the persons whose injustice has driven them to this course escape scot-free and are the loudest in their denunciations. No one knows this fact better than the Indian. Therefore, he is excusable in seeking no justice in a government which only punishes him, while it allows the white man to plunder him as he pleases. That was a quote of General Crook's. The thought of another guerrilla war with the Apaches aroused the utmost abhorrence in Crook. He knew that it was practically impossible to subdue them in a rugged country where the fighting would have to be done. And with all the interests at stake, we cannot afford to fight them, he admitted, frankly. We are too culpable as a nation for the existing condition of affairs. It follows that we must satisfy them, and hereafter they shall be treated with justice and protected from the inroads of the white man. And Crook believed, pardon my coughing, I have a scratchy throat today, as is usual day in, day out. So Crook believed that he could convince Geronimo and the other guerrilla leaders of his good intentions by not fighting them, but by talking with them. The best place for this would be in one of their own Mexican strongholds, where there would be no unscrupulous promoters of Indian wars or rumor-spreading newspapers to stir up a profit-making, land-grabbing war. Boy, Crook had his finger on it. He didn't early on in his career, but he did later. He got it. So, while he waited for a border raid to give him an excuse to enter Mexico, Crook quietly put together his expeditionary force. It consisted of about 50 carefully chosen soldiers and civilian interpreters, and about 200 young Apaches from the reservation, many of whom at one time or another had been raiders in Mexico. And in the early weeks of 1883, he moved part of his force down to the tracks of the new Southern Pacific Railroad, which streaked across Arizona to within about 50 miles of the border. And on March 21st of 1883, 3 minor chiefs, Chato, Chihuahua, believe it or not, Chihuahua, and Bonito, raided a mining camp near Tombstone, Arizona. Now, as soon as Crook learned of the incident, he began final preparations for his Mexican entry. Not until after weeks of searching, however, did his scouts find the location of the Chiricahua-based camp in the Sierra Madres of New Mexico. Imagine if you were Chief Chihuahua of the Chiricahua. What a we think of Chihuahuas only as dogs, so I'm just making a joke, obviously, but you could see the Mexican influence on the language of the Apaches. So in that season, the season when the leaves are dark green, that's May, Geronimo led a raid against Mexican ranchers to obtain cattle. Now, Mexican soldiers pursued them, but Geronimo ambushed the soldiers, punished them severely, and escaped. As the Apaches were returning to their base, one of the men who'd been left behind as a guard met Geronimo and told him that Grey Wolf Crook had captured the camp and all the women and children. Now, Jason Betzinez, one of Geronimo's cousins, who was riding with the Apache party, afterward told of how Geronimo chose two of his older warriors to go down with a truce flag and to find out what the Grey Wolf had come for. Instead of returning to where Geronimo stood, Betzinez said, the two men came back halfway up the mountain and called for us to come down. Our warriors descended the mountainside, went up to General Crook's tent, where after a lengthy conference between the leaders, we all surrendered to the general. And this you can find in a book by Jason Betzinez. And with W.S. Nye, I Fought with Geronimo. And that was put out by Stackpole Company, 1959. And actually, Geronimo had 3 long parleys with Crook before they came to an agreement. The Apache leader declared that he'd always wanted peace, but that he had been ill-treated at San Carlos by bad white men. Crook agreed that this was probably true, but if Geronimo wanted to return to the reservation, the Grey Wolf would see that he was treated fairly. All Chiricahua who returned, however, would have to work at farming and stock raising to make their own livings. I'm not taking your arms from you, Crook added, because I'm not afraid of you. I think that's a very interesting statement that he made. And Geronimo liked Crook's blunt manner. But when the general announced that he must start his column back to Arizona in a day or so, Geronimo decided to test him, to make certain that Crook truly trusted him. The Apache leader said it would require several months to round up all his people. I'll remain here, he said, until I have gathered up the last man, woman, and child of the Chiricahua. Chato would also remain to assist him. Together they would bring all the people to San Carlos. To Geronimo's surprise, General Crook agreed to the proposition, and on May 30th the column started northward. With it went 251 women and children and 123 warriors, including Loco, Mangus, Colorado's son, Chihuahua, Bonito, and even wrinkled old Nana, all the war leaders except Geronimo and Chato. So 8 months passed, and then it was Crook's turn to be surprised. True to their word, Geronimo and Chato crossed the border in February of 1884 and were escorted to San Carlos. Unfortunately, Geronimo made the mistake of driving along with him a large herd of cattle which he had stolen from the Mexicans, Jason Betzinez reported. This seemed quite proper to Geronimo, who felt that he was only providing a good supply of food for his people. The authorities, taking a different view, pried the cattle loose from the chief. And the honest Grey Wolf, Crook, ordered the cattle sold, and then he returned the proceeds of $1,762.50 to the Mexican government for distribution to the original owners if they could not be found. Or if they could be found. So, for more than a year, General Crook would boast that not an outrage or depredation of any kind was committed by the Indians of Arizona and New Mexico. And there we have to stop for the first half. Pick this up right where we left off when we come back.
Are you looking...
Folks, welcome back from that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And then come on over to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, to watch the video simulcast of this broadcast, along with the live chat room going on right now. Now, we left off. Geronimo had come in under General Crook, the agreement he made with him, and he brought cattle, and Crook said, you can't keep it. It's cattle you raided. He took it away and sent the money back to the Mexican government. And now, for more than a year, we left off saying, General Crook could boast that not an outrage or depredation of any kind took place or was committed by the Indians of Arizona and New Mexico. Now, Geronimo and Chato vied with each other in the development of their ranchos, and Crook kept a watchful eye on their agent to see he issued adequate supplies. And outside the reservation and the army posts, however, there was much criticism of Crook for being too easy on the Apaches. The newspapers that he had condemned for disseminating all sorts of exaggerations and falsehoods about the Indians now turned on him. It's politics as usual, folks, and the press as usual, as we've seen it today especially. Some of the rumor mongers went so far as to claim that Crook had surrendered to Geronimo in Mexico and had made a deal with the Chiricahua leader in order to escape alive. As for Geronimo, they made a special demon of him, inventing atrocity, stories by the dozens, and calling on vigilantes to hang him if the government would not. Now, Mickey Free, almost sounds like our Michelle McFree over in the chat room. How you doing, Michelle? Mickey Free, the Chiricahua's official interpreter, told Geronimo about these newspaper stories. When a man tried to do right, Geronimo commented, such stories ought not to be put in the newspapers. And after the corn planting time, that spring of 1885, the Chiricahua grew discontented. There was little for the men to do except draw rations, gamble, quarrel, loaf, and drink Tiswin beer. And Tiswin was forbidden on the reservation, but the Chiricahuas had plenty of corn for brewing it, and drinking was one of the few pleasures of the old days that was left to them. And on the night of May 17th, Geronimo, Magnus, Chihuahua, and Old Nana all got fairly well hammered on Tiswin, and they decided to go to Mexico. They went to see Chato to invite him to go along, but Chato was sober, and he refused to join the party. He and Geronimo had a bitter quarrel over this, which very nearly ended in violence before Geronimo and the others departed. In the group were 92 women and children, 8 boys, 34 men. As they left San Carlos, Geronimo cut the telegraph wire. Many reasons were given by both white men and Apache for this sudden exodus from a reservation where everything apparently seemed to be going just smoothly. And some said it was because of the Tiswin spree. Others said that the bad stories going around about the Chiricahuas made them fearful of being arrested. Having been placed in irons once before when the band was shipped to San Carlos, Jason Bensonez said some of the leaders determined not to undergo such treatment ever again. Now, Geronimo later explained it this way. He said, Sometime before I left, an Indian named Wadiske had a talk with me. He said, "They're going to arrest you," but I paid no attention to him, knowing that I had done no wrong, and the wife of Mangus, Hera, told me that they were going to seize me and put me and Mangus in the guardhouse. And I learned from the American and Apache soldiers, from Chato and Mickey Free, that the Americans were going to arrest me and hang me. So I left. Now, those were his own words, and this is out of Benson's book. And so the flight of Geronimo's party across Arizona was a signal for outpouring of wild rumors. Newspapers featured big headlines. "The Apaches are out!" exclamation point. The very word Geronimo became a cry for blood. Geronimo! We've all heard it used in comic ways. And the Tucson ring of contractors, seeing a chance for a profitable military campaign, called on General Crook to rush troops to protect defenseless white citizens from the murderous Apache. Geronimo, however, was desperately trying to avoid any confrontation with white citizens altogether. All he wanted to do was speed his people across the border to the old Sierra Madre sanctuary. For 2 days and nights, the Chiricahua rode without making camp. Along the way, Chihuahua changed his mind about going to Mexico, and he turned his band off the trail, intending to return to the reservation. Pursuing soldiers caught up with Chihuahua, forced him into a fight, and started him on a bloody trail of plundering before he could cross back into Mexico. And every assault he committed was blamed on Geronimo, because few Arizonans had ever heard of Chihuahua. So Crook, meanwhile, was trying to avoid the vast military operation that the Tucson Ring and their political friends in Washington were demanding of him. He knew that personal negotiation was the only way to deal with 36 Apache warriors. For the benefit of local citizens, however, he ordered a few cavalrymen to march out of each fort under his command, but he depended entirely on his trusted Apache scouts to find the resistant Chiricahua. And he was gratified that Chato and Cochise's younger son, Alchis, both volunteered to help search for Geronimo. And as autumn approached, it was clear that Crook was would once again have to cross the border into Mexico. And his orders from Washington were explicit: kill the fugitives or take their unconditional surrenders. So by this time, the Chiricahua had discovered that units of the Mexican army were waiting for them in the Sierra Madre. And caught between Mexicans who wanted only to kill and the Americans who were willing to take prisoners of them, Geronimo and the other leaders finally decided to listen to Chato and Alchis. And on March 25th of 1886, the hostile Apache chiefs met with Crook a few miles south of the border at Canon de los Embudos. And after 3 days of emotional speech-making, the Chiricahuas agreed to surrender. Crook then told them that they have to surrender without conditions, and when they asked what that meant, he told them frankly that they would probably be taken far away to the east, to Florida, to become prisoners. They replied that they would not surrender unless the Gray Wolf would promise that they would be returned to their reservation after 2 years of imprisonment. Crook thought the proposition over. It seemed really fair to him. Believing that he could convince Washington that such a surrender was better than no surrender, he agreed. "I give myself up to you," Geronimo said. "Do with me what you please. I surrender. Once I moved about like the wind. Now I surrender to you, and that is all." Alchis closed the council with a plea to Crook to have pity on his erring Chiricahua brothers. "They are all good friends now, and I'm glad that they have surrendered, because they are all the same people, all one family with me, just like when you kill a deer, all its parts are of the one body. So with the Chiricahua, now we want to travel along the open road and drink the waters of the Americans, and not hide in the mountains. We want to live without danger or discomfort. I'm very glad that the Chiricahuas surrendered and that I've been able to talk for them. I have never told you a lie, nor have you ever told me a lie. And now I tell you that these Chiricahua really want to do what is right and live at peace. If they don't, then I lie, and you must not believe me anymore. It's all right. You're going ahead to Fort Bowie. I want you to carry away in your pocket all that has been said here today. And that was the speech that was made by Cochise. Yes, that's the speech he made. And this was in the U.S. Congress, the 51st session, the Senate meetings, and it was all Chise who made that speech at the end, and convinced that the Chiricahua would come into Fort Bowie with his scouting troop, Crook hurried on there to telegraph the War Department in Washington the terms he had given the Chiricahua chiefs. Now, to his dismay, a reply came back: cannot assent to surrender of the hostiles on the terms of their imprisonment. East for 2 years with their understanding of their return to the reservation. End of telegraph. Now the Gray Wolf had made another promise he could not keep. As a crowning blow, he heard the next day that Geronimo and Naiche had broken away from the column a few miles below Fort Bowie and were fleeing back into Mexico. A traitor from the Tucson Ring had filled them full of whiskey and lies about how the white citizens of Arizona would surely hang them if they returned. Now, according to Jason Bensonez, Naiche got drunk and fired his gun in the air. Geronimo thought that fighting had broken out with the troops, and Naiche stampeded, taking with them some 30 followers. Perhaps there was no more to it than that. I feared treachery, Geronimo said afterward, and when we became suspicious, we turned back. Now, Naiche later told Crook, I was afraid I was going to be taken off somewhere I didn't like, to some place I didn't know. I thought all who were taken away would die. I worked it out in my own mind. We talked to each other about it. We were drunk. Because there was a lot of whiskey there and we wanted a drink, we took it. Now, as a result of Geronimo's flight, the War Department severely reprimanded Crook for his negligence, for granting unauthorized surrender terms, and for his tolerant attitude toward the Indians. And he immediately resigned, and he was replaced by Nelson Miles, that's Bearcoat, if you remember him, a brigadier general eager for promotion. Now, Bearcoat took command on April 12th of 1886. With full support from the War Department, he quickly put 5,000 soldiers into the field, about 1/3 of the combat strength of the army. He also had 500 Apache scouts and thousands of irregular civilian militia. And he organized a flying column of cavalrymen and an expensive system of heliographs to flash messages back and forth across Arizona and New Mexico. And the enemy to be subdued by this powerful military force was Geronimo and his army, quote-unquote, of 24 warriors, who throughout the summer of 1886 were also under the constant pursuit by thousands of soldiers of the Mexican army. So you got thousands of soldiers after Geronimo and his 24 guys. In the end, it was the big-nosed captain, Lieutenant Charles Gatewood. I have to think of Rocky Stucci there. Sorry, Rocky. Sorry, brother. We always joke around about Rocky's nose. And the 2 Apache scouts get a big Roman nose. It's glorious. You know, it's empirical looking. So, so it was Charles Gatewood and 2 Apache scouts, Maritine and Cayeta, who found Geronimo and Naiche hiding out in the canyon of the Sierra Madres. And Geronimo laid down his rifle and shook hands with the big-nosed captain, inquiring calmly about his health. He then asked about matters back in the United States. How were the Chiricahua faring? Gatewood told him that the Chiricahua who surrendered had already been shipped to Florida. If Geronimo would surrender to General Miles, he also would probably be sent to Florida to join them. Geronimo wanted to know all about Bearcoat Miles. His voice was his voice harsh or agreeable to the ear? Was he cruel or kind-hearted? Did he look you in the eyes or down at the ground when he talked? Would he keep his promises? Then he said to Gatewood, "We want your advice. Consider yourself one of us and not a white man. Remember all that has been said today, and as an Apache, what would you advise us to do under the circumstances?" "I would trust General Miles and take him at his word," Gatewood replied. And so Geronimo surrendered for the last time. The great father in Washington, Grover Cleveland now, who believed all the lurid newspaper tales of Geronimo's evil deeds, recommended that he be hanged. The Council of White Men, who knew better, prevailed, and Geronimo and his surviving warriors were shipped to Fort Marion, Florida. He found most of his friends dying there in that warm and humid land, so unlike the dry, high country of their birth. And more than 100 died of disease diagnosed as consumption. Now, consumption, isn't that what we call tuberculosis? So the government took all their children away from them, and they sent them to the Indian school at Carlisle. And that's in Pennsylvania now. More than 50 of their children died there. Not only were the hostiles removed to Florida, but so many were of the friendlies. So were many of the friendlies, including the scouts who had worked for Crook, Martine, and Cayeta, who led Lieutenant Gatewood to Geronimo's hiding place. They didn't receive the 10 ponies promised them for their mission. Instead, they were shipped to imprisonment in Florida. Chato, who had tried to dissuade Geronimo from leaving the reservation, and then had helped Crook find him, was suddenly removed from his rancho and sent to Florida. He lost his land allotment and all his livestock. 2 of his children were taken to Carlisle, and both died there. The Chiricahua were marked for extinction. They had fought too hard to be able to allow them to keep their freedom. But they were not alone. Escaminzan of Aravapai, who had become economically independent on his Gila ranch, was arrested on the charge of communicating with an outlaw known as the Apache Kid. Now, Escaminzan and the 40 surviving Aravaipa were sent to live in the Chiricahuas with the Chiricahuas in Florida. Later, all these exiles were transferred to Mount Vernon Barracks, Alabama. Now, had it not been for the efforts of a few white friends, such as George Crook, John Clume, and Hugh Scott, the Apaches soon would have been driven into the ground at that fever-ridden post on the Mobile River. Over the objections of Bearcoat Miles and the War Department, they succeeded in having Escaminzan and the Avarapoi return to San Carlos. And the citizens of Arizona, however, refused to admit Geronimo's Chiricahuas within the state. And when the Kiowa and the Comanche learned of the Chiricahuas' I messed up my sentence because I messed up a couple of words. Arizona refused to admit Geronimo's Chiricahuas within the state. And when the Kiowa and the Comanche learned of the Chiricahuas' plight from Lieutenant Hugh Scott, they offered their old Apache enemies a part of their reservation, and in 1894, Geronimo brought the surviving exiles to Fort Sill. When he died there a few years later in 1909, still a prisoner of war, he was buried in the Apache cemetery. It was about 15 years later. And a legend still persists that not long afterward his bones were secretly removed and taken somewhere to the southwest, perhaps to the Mogollons or to the Chiricahua Mountains, or deep into the Sierra Madres of Mexico. He was the last of the Apache chiefs. And now there's a song. It's called The Buffalo Were Coming. I can't sing this, and I'll try to do it some justice so you can hear the language, and then I'll tell you what it says in English. and I'll probably have the meter all off because I don't know the language. Hataiwaka I tarawa. Ha re ra kera ra weku eruta. Ra ha re ra ta ha. Ta ra ha re ra. And it goes on like that. Ta ra ha re ra. Ura wi riku satera ha re ra ta ra ha ra ta ra ha re ha ta ha re ra. And so I wish I could sing that the way it's supposed to sound. The ha re ha ra. And I can't. I'm going to learn that. I pledge. So the song actually says this. Listen, he said, yonder the buffalo are coming. These are his sayings. Yonder the buffalo are coming. They walk, they stand, they are coming. Yonder the buffalo are coming. And that's the song that we see after the death of Geronimo. I wanted to show you a picture of Geronimo, this fearsome warrior in his old age. And here he is. Let me show you first. Here he is again as a younger man. You can see he's not young at all. He's probably in his 40s to 50s here. He's on the far right in this picture, for those of you who can see this on the YouTube channel. And that's Geronimo on the far right when he's leading his men. And they're all armed, as you can see. And now, this is Geronimo when he is older. Here he is, the old man who says, they write things about me in the newspaper that aren't true. He says, they want me hanged. Why would they say these things? That should stop. And of course, he eventually had died at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And there he is as an elderly man, probably around 1900 to 1905 would be my guess. And he died in 1909. So just about 110 years ago. So that is the end of Geronimo and the last of the Apache chiefs. And we've got a few minutes here left at the end of the show. And I could do any number of things with this, but I think because I want to get us through the end of the material that I have here, I want us to move on and talk about something that I talked about a year ago. And there are recordings where I've talked about this before. And this is how we're going to wrap up this whole series that we've been doing on Native America. And it's by starting by introducing the ghost dance, and then which led up to, of course, the massacre at Wounded Knee, which was really the last of the great massacres that took place of Native American people, and that was in 1890. And so, you see here, let's set a historical stage for the ghost dance. In 1887, now, this is where we are. 1887, the U.S. Congress creates in February an Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroads. And June 21st of 1887, Britain celebrates the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And on July 2nd through the 4th, the Union and Confederate veterans hold a reunion at Gettysburg. The Union and the Confederacy celebrated together. And this would be a little over 20 years after the end of the Civil War. In 1888, May 14th, Brazil abolishes slavery. About 20 years after we did. November 6th, Grover Cleveland, the president, receives more popular votes than Benjamin Harrison, but Harrison wins the presidency by electoral votes. In 1889, March 4th, Benjamin Harrison is inaugurated as president. March 23rd, President Harrison opens Oklahoma, the former Indian Territory, to white settlement. And this is where you have the Great Oklahoma Land Rush. March 31st, the Eiffel Tower is completed in Paris. And May 31st, 5,000 loose lives in Johnston, or 5,000 lose their lives, in the Johnstown flood. November 2nd through 11th, North and South Dakota, Montana, and Washington all become states of the Union. In 1890, on January 21st, Nellie Bly wins the race around the world in 72 days, 6 hours and 11 minutes. June 1st, the population of the United States in 1890 reaches 62,622,250 individuals. July 3rd through the 10th, Idaho and Wyoming become the 43rd and the 44th states of the Union. Now, I have a couple of quotes here. One is by Tatanka Yotanka, who is Sitting Bull. He said, remember him now? He's been up in Canada, of the Oglala Sioux. And if a man loses anything and goes back and looks carefully for it, he will find it. And that's what the Indians are doing now when they ask you to give them the things that were promised them in the past. And I do not consider that they should be treated like beasts. And that is the reason I have grown up with the feelings I have. I feel that my country has gotten a bad name, and I want it to have a good name. It used to have a good name, and I sit sometimes and wonder who it is that has given it a bad name. Then you have this quote from White Thunder. Our land here is the dearest thing on earth to us. Men take up land and get rich on it, and it's very important for us Indians to keep it. And then I have another quote here, and this is by, you'll recognize him if you were here a year ago. This is Wovoka, the Paiute Messiah, the man who came offering the ghost dance of peace. And he said this, Wovoka, all Indians must dance everywhere. Keep on dancing. Pretty soon, in next spring, Great Spirit comes. He bring back all game of every kind. The game be thick everywhere. All dead Indians come back and live again. They will all be strong just like the young men. Be young again. Old blind Indians see again and get young and have very fine time. When Great Spirit comes this way, then all the Indians go to the mountains, high up away from the whites. Whites can't hurt Indians. Not then. Then, while Indians way up high, big flood comes like water, and all white people die, get drowned. After that, water go away, and then nobody but Indians everywhere, and game all kinds thick. Then medicine men tell Indians to send word to all Indians to keep up dancing, and all the good time will come. The Indians who don't dance, who don't believe in this word, will grow little, just about a foot high, and they stay that way. Some of them will be turned into wood and be burned in fire.